In the Q&A sessions, there were some questions about the different types of mental states in the initial classification. So I'll address them briefly again and say something about the different possibilities we have of adjusting the initial classification. So let me start by looking at the classification again, just to refresh your. So we have experiences, phenomenal consciousness, mental states that have a quale, have what's it likeness. We have cognitive states, they are about something, they have intentionality, and we have the emotions, they have both these properties. They have a certain feel to them, so a certain quale, and they are about something. And this is standard classical traditional way of dividing mental states. And this is an initial classification, right? So this is an introductory course and we have to start somewhere. And if you want to address the problem, how the mind fits in the physical world, you need to know what we mean by the mind. And then later you might say, well, maybe we need to adjust this classification a little bit. I'll come to that in a moment. There's one thing I want to talk about before we go to possible adjustments, and that is the propositional attitude. So that's a stance towards the meaning of a sentence. So an attitude towards a proposition. So the attitude is a stance, like knowing that, hoping that, believing that. And then you have the proposition, and that is the meaning of a sentence. So we have all kinds of sentences. There's just sounds, and they have meaning for us. And this meaning, in a word, we could call that a concept. So a word expresses a concept, and a sentence expresses a proposition. And of course, then you can have an attitude towards that proposition. If the sun is shining, you can have the attitude, the stance towards the sentence, the sun is shining, that you know this. So you can say, I know that the sun is shining. And that would then be your propositional attitude. Now, these are discrete entities, and we talked about that in the Q&A sessions. And not everybody was there, and maybe you want to listen to that again. So a discrete entity is just another word for thing, and discrete just means it's separated from other things and doesn't influence the other things. So for instance, if you take my bookcase, if I get rid of one book, or if I take one book because I want to read it, or I want to throw it away because it's really bad philosophy, then that doesn't do anything with the rest of the books. The content of the rest of the books stays the same, the letters in it stays the same, the amount of pages stays the same, the shape stays the same, all these books remain the same. These are all discrete entities, not being influenced by the other books. The ideas, the propositional attitudes, are also discrete entities. So if I get maybe if I get a new book in my bookcase, that also doesn't change anything to the other books. If I get a new propositional attitude, like to believe that, tomorrow the sun will not be shining, it will be really bad weather, I could believe that. So I could believe that tomorrow is going to be bad weather. Then that doesn't change anything to the beliefs that I have about my books in my bookcase, about my students, about my telephone, about my mother, whatever. So this belief can be added to my beliefs. This propositional attitude can be added to my other propositional attitudes without changing them. And I might also forget this, and probably will, because you remembers every belief they had about the weather next day. So you will forget a lot of your propositional attitudes. without altering the rest of your beliefs. So it looks like propositional attitudes indeed are discrete entities. They are separate things you can learn or unlearn, that is, forget. Okay, so let's now turn to the reasons why we might change our initial classification. I will address some of these reasons why we might change this classification. And that those things are open for debate, so it might not be necessary. And I'll address some of the things we haven't seen in the lectures already, but then you have them all together. So, do propositional attitudes even exist? This is a problem with connectionism, or a question that arises if you look at connectionism, because if propositional attitudes exist as separate entities, as discrete entities, then that means that they have to be placed in your brain, in your mind, in such a way that they indeed do not influence the other propositional attitudes, just like books in a bookcase. If I put a new book in my bookcase, that doesn't change any of the books. So if I put a belief in my belief case, in my brain, then, well, it shouldn't change my other beliefs, my other propositional attitudes, my other thoughts. And if connectionism is the right model of how the brain represents things, how we can have thoughts, then you see that a lot of neurons, a lot of units, are involved in representing something. So in storing information, in representing a propositional attitude. But then one propositional attitude is represented in a distributed fashion by a lot of neurons, and another propositional attitude is also represented, stored, realized by the same neurons. And in order to store a new propositional attitude in the same system, you have to change the weight, or the way the neurons fire and are connected to each other. And that means that you store it in the same place. Unlike books, if you put a new book in a bookcase, then you place it on a different part of the shelves. A new propositional attitude would be learned by changing your brain a little bit, but that changes the other propositional attitudes. And if you learn a lot new propositions and use the same neurons to represent them, then you run the risk of changing so much that all propositional attitudes just have gone. So that means that if propositional attitudes are discrete entities, they can't exist if connectionism is right. So that's one way we might to have adjust our initial classification. Another possible adjustment is the idea that we can have cognition without aboutness. So again, that's something that's open for debate. I'm not saying that this is possible, but when we will be discussing the embodied and embedded theory of the mind, then we will talk about examples of solving cognitive problems. So the problems in these examples are called cognitive problems by the defenders of this theory of the embodied and embedded mind. And these examples are examples where cognitive problems are solved without mental states that have aboutness. And then the question is, do we here have cognition without aboutness, cognition without intentionality? And if so, then we need to change our definition of cognition, because cognition then clearly is sometimes a mental state that has aboutness, but not all cognitive states then apparently have intentionality. They do not all have aboutness. The other way, of course, is you could go is say, well, these are not proper examples of cognition or of the solution of cognitive problems. So we'll see that when we talk about that in a next lecture. But well, that's also a reason why we might change our initial classification. Another way of thinking about changing the classification is we are talking about mental states. And of course, this is meant to be as a kind of variable, and that the word state could also mean event, could also mean property, and it could indeed mean state, a stable state. And I think maybe maybe it doesn't really matter for the initial classification, but if you see that brain states are constantly changing and that mental states are constantly changing, so you hear the sound of my voice, and this information is processed by your brain. So your brain is changing when you listen to someone. And you're understanding what I'm saying. So also your cognitive states are changing. And that means that it's kind of strange to talk about states. Why is that the default term? So maybe it doesn't really matter, because state is meant to be a variable that could also be event, could also mean event, but why not talk about events? Why not talk about mental events and brain processes? So I think that might be a more truthful use of our language. But of course, that's also something that's open for debate.